There's a 2-minute window sometime in late June when a commercial satellite passing 300 miles above the Iranian desert took a photograph that Tan almost certainly hoped no one would ever see. Nobody on the ground looked up. Nobody heard anything. A machine in orbit simply did what it was built to do and kept moving. It would be days before anyone on Earth understood what that single frame actually proved. And when analysts finally lined it up against a second image taken 2 weeks later, the picture that emerged wasn't just evidence of construction work. It was evidence of a government rebuilding a nuclear weapons facility while it was still on paper bound by a signed agreement not to. That contradiction, a country reconstructing the exact infrastructure it promised to freeze in the exact window when no one was supposed to be watching, is the story underneath every headline this week. If you want to understand why this particular set of images landed with so much force and why the timing of their release looks less like a coincidence and more like a calculated decision by someone in Washington, you have to slow down and take this one piece at a time. This channel tracks the imagery side of this story closer than most outlets bother to. So if that's the angle you're here for, subscribing actually helps. To understand why a couple of satellite photos of a construction site could rattle an entire diplomatic process, you have to go back further than this month. Further even than this year, Iran's nuclear infrastructure did not become a flashpoint in 2026. It became one in June of 2025 during what's now referred to as the 12th Day War, when Israeli strikes tore into the country's enrichment and weapons testing network for the first time at scale. The facility at the center of this new controversy underground site, called Talzan 2, tucked inside the sprawling Parchin military complex southeast of Tehran, was one of the hardest hit. Experts who study Iran's weapons program believe Talzan 2 was used to store and test explosive components tied specifically to nuclear weapons development, not civilian power generation. It was destroyed in the October 2024 strikes, rebuilt, and then struck again in March. By any normal accounting, that should have been the end of it, at least for a while. But normal accounting doesn't really apply to Iran's nuclear program because the pattern here isn't new. After the 2020 war, satellite imagery from Planet Labs began picking up something strange at 2 other sites, Natanz and Isfahan. Not reconstruction exactly. New roofs, simple structures built directly over bomb-damaged buildings. Roofs that serve no purpose except one, blocking the view from above. Independent analysts who examined those images were blunt about what they meant. Iran wasn't rebuilding its enrichment capacity yet. It was making sure nobody could see what it was doing next. And directly south of Natanz's perimeter fence at a mountain locals call Kwa Kalangazla or Pickaxe Mountain, excavation that had quietly started back in 2023 kept expanding. Dirt piles grew, tunnels went deeper. Analysts who track the site believe Iran is building an entirely new underground enrichment facility there, one designed from the outset to survive the kind of strikes that flattened Natanz and Isfahan. That's the backdrop, a regime rebuilding in the shadows, even while claiming publicly that its nuclear ambitions had been set back for years. Then came the diplomacy. On June 17th of this year, Iran and the United States finalized a memorandum of understanding, a framework meant to freeze Iranian nuclear activity in exchange for the gradual release of frozen financial assets. It was fragile from the start, built on a level of mutual distrust that made almost everyone involved skeptical it would hold. But for a few weeks, it held. Strikes paused. Diplomatic channels through Oman stayed open. Both governments had at least a temporary incentive to be seen honoring their end of it, which is exactly what makes the timing of what happened next so difficult to explain away as coincidence. Here's the part of the story that deserves a much slower explanation than it usually gets, because the mechanics of how this particular leak happened are almost more revealing than the images themselves. For months, The US government had maintained tight restrictions on commercial satellite companies, effectively barring firms like Planet Labs and Vantor from distributing high-resolution imagery of sensitive sites across Iran and the wider region. That restriction wasn't incidental. Limiting who can see what's happening on the ground is itself a form of control, a way of managing the public narrative around an active conflict zone. And then for a brief window in late June and early July, that restriction was quietly eased, just long enough for new imagery to become commercially available again, just long enough for CNN, working with analysts at the Institute for Science and International Security, to acquire images from Vantor showing exactly what was happening at Talzan 2 during that period. The images themselves tell a very specific story once you know how to read them. The first set taken on June 22nd showed activity that looked at first like cleanup excavation around the bomb, penetration holes in the facility's roof, debris being cleared, the kind of work you'd expect from a country simply assessing the damage it had suffered. That's not unusual on its own. Any government hit by precision strikes wants to know exactly what survived and what didn't. But the second set of images taken on July 7th showed something categorically different. Additional concrete reinforcement, the apparent installation of rebar, specifically the kind used to prepare for a permanent concrete cap. That's not damage assessment anymore. That's the early architecture of reconstruction. And it was happening 15 days after Iran had signed an agreement explicitly committing to freeze exactly this kind of activity. It's worth sitting with how the analysis process actually works here, because this isn't guesswork dressed up as certainty. Satellite imagery analysts don't just look at a single photo and draw conclusions. They compare sequential images of the same coordinates over time, tracking specific physical changes. A pile of dirt that grows between two passes means excavation is ongoing. A gap in a roofline that gets smaller between two passes means something is being rebuilt over it. Vehicle tracks that appear where none existed before mean equipment or personnel moved through recently. None of this requires access to classified intelligence. It's built entirely from commercially available imagery cross-referenced against known site layouts, which is exactly why this kind of open source analysis has become such a powerful tool in tracking nuclear proliferation. It also means Iran can't credibly dispute what the images show, because the same imagery is available to any government, journalist, or independent researcher willing to pay for satellite access. That's a different kind of pressure than an intelligence agency making an accusation behind closed doors. This is a receipt sitting in the open that anyone can go check for themselves. The natural question is why Iran would take this risk at all, knowing that commercial satellites make this kind of activity nearly impossible to hide indefinitely. And the honest answer is that Tran has done a version of this calculation before and won. After the 2025 strikes, Iran discovered that simply putting a roof over a damaged building was often enough to stall meaningful international scrutiny for months, because the alternative to satellite monitoring is physical inspection. And Iran has systematically restricted access for IAEA inspectors since the strikes began. The International Atomic Energy AI's Director General, Rafael Gisset, has said plainly that inspections will happen eventually, but eventually is doing a lot of work in that sentence. In the meantime, the agency has publicly confirmed that Iran was constructing a third enrichment site near Isfahan. Information that came out specifically because satellite tracking made it impossible to deny, not because Iran volunteered it. That pattern is the real story here. And it's bigger than one facility. Iran's strategy since the 2025 war hasn't been to abandon its nuclear infrastructure. It's been to rebuild selectively, quietly, and just fast enough to stay ahead of the next round of inspections or the next diplomatic deadline, betting that global attention will move somewhere else before anyone forces a real reckoning. Talzan 2 fits that pattern precisely. It's not the flagship enrichment facility. It's not Natanz or Fordo, the sites that dominate headlines. It's a smaller, less visible facility tied to weapons testing rather than uranium enrichment itself, which makes it exactly the kind of target Iran might have calculated would draw less international attention if caught. That calculation appears to have been wrong. Now, layer in the diplomatic and political dimension, because this is where the story stops being just about concrete and rebar and starts being about leverage. The June 17th memorandum was never just a nuclear agreement. It was tied directly to the release of Iranian financial assets that had been frozen for years. Assets Tan badly needs given how deep the economic damage from ongoing sanctions and military conflict has cut into the country's finances. Every day that memorandum held, Iran had more to gain from playing along on paper while quietly rebuilding underneath it. That's not a contradiction from Thran's perspective. It's the entire point. Freeze what the satellites can see, rebuild what they can't. Keep the financial pipeline open for as long as possible while restoring whatever capabilities survived the 2025 strikes. The Iranian government's public posture around all of this has been notably contradictory, and that contradiction is itself informative. Officials have simultaneously accused the United States and Israel of unprovoked aggression against a peaceful civilian program, while Iran's own deputy foreign minister, Kazem Babadi, has openly floated the possibility of withdrawing from the nuclear non-proliferation treaty entirely. That threat matters more than it might sound. Only one country has ever actually withdrawn from the NPT, North Korea. And North Korea used exactly that withdrawal to build the clandestine weapons program that gives it nuclear weapons today. When an Iranian official raises that comparison publicly, even as a threat rather than a formal announcement, it's not idle rhetoric. It's a signal about where the regime believes its own red lines actually sit and how far it's willing to go if the current diplomatic track collapses entirely. There's also a quieter, more uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this, and it's worth being honest about it rather than flattening it into a clean narrative. Nobody outside a very small circle of Iranian officials actually knows how much of the country's pre-2025 enriched uranium stockpile survived the strikes. Before the war, Iran had enriched uranium at Fordo and Natanz and processed uranium metal at Isfahan at a scale that had alarmed international monitors for years after the strikes. Imagery showed virtually no activity resuming at any of the three sites for months. That absence of visible activity was interpreted by some analysts as proof the program had been meaningfully set back. But an absence of visible activity is not the same thing as an absence of activity. It's entirely possible to hide movement of the most sensitive material underground away from any camera in orbit, especially inside a country that has already spent a decade building elaborate physical infrastructure specifically designed to defeat surveillance. The roofs at Natanz and Isfahan exist for exactly that reason. So does Pickaxe Mountain. Iran doesn't need every facility rebuilt to remain a serious proliferation concern. It needs enough surviving material and enough hidden capacity to reconstitute a program quickly once the world's attention moves on. And every piece of imagery collected since the 2025 war fits a pattern consistent with exactly that strategy. None of that changes what these images mean for the people actually living through the consequences of this standoff. And it's worth slowing down here before moving to what comes next. Every time this conflict escalates, it is an abstract for the people inside Iran. The country has spent the past year absorbing military strikes, economic strangulation from sanctions, and now a domestic security crackdown tied to nationwide protests that erupted alongside the growing pressure from outside. Ordinary Iranian families have no meaningful influence over whether Talzan 2 gets a new concrete cap or whether Pickaxe Mountain keeps expanding. They live with a sanctions regime that punishes the entire economy regardless of who's actually making decisions about centrifuges and enrichment levels. On the other side, American and allied intelligence agencies, satellite analysts, and diplomats have spent months trying to build an accurate picture of a program that Iran has every incentive to obscure, knowing that miscalculating in either direction, underestimating what survived, or overreacting to normal reconstruction carries real consequences for a region that's already absorbed more than a year of open conflict. There is no version of this story where the honest answer is simple, and anyone telling you it is hasn't looked closely enough at what these images actually show versus what they merely suggest. So where does this actually go from here? Based on everything currently visible in the public record, there are 4 plausible paths, and they carry very different levels of risk. The first is that the memorandum survives in some diminished form, with Washington treating the Talzan 2 revelations as a violation serious enough to demand new concessions, but not serious enough to abandon diplomacy entirely. This is the path officials on both sides would likely claim to prefer publicly, since neither government currently seems eager to reopen full-scale strikes, while other fronts, from the Gulf blockade to renewed tension with Ukraine, are already stretching resources thin. But here's the problem with that path. Trust was already the scarcest resource in this relationship before these images surfaced, and catching Iran rebuilding weapons infrastructure 15 days after signing an agreement not to makes it significantly harder for Washington to sell any continuation of that agreement as anything other than a strategic mistake. The second path is that this becomes the justification for a renewed round of strikes, treating the reconstruction at Talzan 2 as proof that diplomacy has already failed, and that only continued military pressure can reliably degrade Iran's program. This is arguably the more likely outcome, given how quickly the current administration has shown itself willing to authorize strikes when it concludes diplomatic patience has run out. But the problem here is escalation risk. Iran has already shown through its posture in the Gulf and its indirect approach to retaliation that it prefers proxy pressure and economic coercion over direct confrontation. A renewed strike campaign specifically targeting nuclear infrastructure risks pushing Tehran toward exactly the kind of overt weaponization threat, including a formal NPT withdrawal that everyone involved has spent years trying to avoid triggering. The third path is that Iran continues its current strategy essentially unchanged, betting that global attention will move on to the next crisis before meaningful consequences catch up with it. This is the path Iran's behavior since the 2025 war suggests it's most comfortable with. Rebuild quietly, deny loudly, and absorb whatever temporary diplomatic cost comes from getting caught, calculating that the alternative, genuinely abandoning weapons relevant infrastructure, costs the regime more politically than another round of accusations from Washington ever will. But the problem with that path is that commercial satellite coverage keeps improving. Restrictions on imagery access keep getting quietly lifted and reimposed based on political convenience. And the odds of getting caught again and again keep rising every month. This continues. The fourth and most consequential path is the one hinted at by Iran's own deputy foreign minister, a formal withdrawal from the non-proliferation treaty following the exact precedent North Korea set decades ago. This remains the lowest probability outcome in the near term because it would eliminate whatever legal ambiguity currently allows Iran to frame its program as defensive and civilian in nature, and it would almost certainly trigger the kind of unified international response TAN has so far managed to avoid by operating in the gray zone between compliance and defiance. But it's also the outcome that would most permanently reshape this entire situation. And every thread of it moves the baseline of what's considered thinkable a little further than it was before. If I had to rank these by what's most likely to actually happen over the coming weeks, continued quiet reconstruction paired with intermittent diplomatic friction remains the most probable path, simply because it's the one Iran has already shown repeatedly it's willing to walk. The renewed strike scenario is a close second and would likely be triggered less by these specific images and more by whatever comes next if similar activity gets caught at additional sites. The diplomatic survival path and the formal NPT withdrawal remain the least likely in the immediate term, but both carry consequences large enough that even a small probability of either deserves close attention, which brings this story back to that 2-minute window in late June when a satellite passed silently over a patch of desert southeast of Tehran had captured a photograph nobody on the ground even noticed. That single image didn't end anything. It didn't start a new war, and it didn't collapse the memorandum outright. What it did was strip away the plausible deniability that had allowed both governments to publicly claim progress while privately preparing for the possibility that none of it would hold. Iran can dispute the interpretation of what those images show. It cannot dispute that the concrete is there, that the rebar is there, and that both appeared exactly during the window when Tehran had promised the world it would be doing neither. So here's the actual question worth sitting with. When a government gets caught rebuilding the exact infrastructure it just promised to freeze, does that prove the agreement was doomed from the moment it was signed? Or does it prove that even a fragile, mistrustful framework is still doing its job simply by making violations visible instead of invisible? Drop your read on that in the comments. And if you want to see what the next set of images reveals, subscribe, because whatever direction this goes, it won't stay quiet for